I don't know if you know this. Do you realize our church turns 150 next year? Like, get the party planning committee going. We got to get this. It's 150. Our church, 150 years ago, I would not be there, at least not in this role like this. They would not have had a youth minister. It has nothing to do with their size or the teenagers or anything like that. Youth ministry didn't exist 150 years ago. And the whole reason we have children's ministry, family ministry, youth ministry is because of a shift in culture that happened after our church. Like, our church is older than youth ministry. That's just a weird thing to think about. But what I do is very impacted by culture. So where this really came to a head is I read a book years ago. A friend of mine said, this is a wonderful book, you got to read it. It was called The Celtic Way of Evangelism. Fantastic book. And I thought, I want to learn more about this Celtic church because, it's fascinating to me. So I pre-ordered a course. Have you ever done this where you bought something and it wasn't ready, so then you just had to wait? And then one day you just get a surprise of like, oh, and then you're like, hey, what's this? And so that happened to me a few months ago. I was like, what's this? And I opened my email and free books, which is fantastic. Well, free, I paid for them. I just forgot I paid for them. Now they're free. But I get all these books and I'm reading all this stuff and I understand, okay, this church is very different because of their culture. So then I started figuring out, how do I learn more about Irish culture? So I'm reading like these books by this professor over in New England. I'm listening to Irish music. I signed up for Riverdance classes. I did not sign up for Riverdance classes. That's just, no, nothing about that would praise Jesus. But just let you know. But I'm going through all this stuff, trying to figure out the culture and trying to figure out, like, what is different. And it's amazing how much, like I said, just realizing and learning the history, like how culture makes such a difference. Like, this ancient Irish church is called the ancient Irish church because it's not around anymore. They still have Christians in Ireland. There's still a church in Ireland. It is way different than it was 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago. And part of that is because, this is a great story. Part of that is because there's a man who was king of part of Great Britain. His name was King Oswy. And at the time, this would be 1,400 years ago-ish, there was the Roman church, which was the popular one, and that was the one that most people ascribed to, and then there was the Irish church. And it's not they didn't get along, but they were so far apart from each other, it really didn't matter. So King Oswy, he was a part of the Roman church, and his wife was part of the Irish church. And where this came to a head in the family was Easter was celebrated on different days by both those churches. So what would happen every year is one of them would say, it's Easter, let's prepare this celebration, let's get the feast ready, let's be prepared to celebrate Christ's resurrection. And the other one would go, no, I can't. I'm still fasting. You go enjoy your meal while I sit over here quietly enjoying my, And every year this would happen where half the house would be one side, half the house would be the other way. And finally, King Oswy said, that's it, I'm done. I want to have Easter dinner with my wife. This is what we're going to do. And he had representatives from the Roman church come all the way to him. He had representatives from the Irish church come to him. He said, all you sit down, talk about it, make your case, and I will decide which way the entire kingdom will go based on what you say this weekend. Like, the fate of a church was not decided because of their theology or working together or how they worship. It was about dinner. Really. I mean, it's oversimplifying, don't get me wrong. There's like many other steps, but that was one of the catalysts was I want to eat with my wife, figure it out. That and haircuts. Because apparently very holy people would shave their head, half their head, and the Roman church would shave the top half, so you got that nice super bald spot here. But the Irish church would shave the front half and leave the back long like a super mullet. That should have been the decider right there. But these kind of arguments are the arguments that they presented. And eventually, King Oswy had to make the decision. And he said, after listening to all this stuff, he said, well, you've all made good points. And it didn't come down to their theology again or the way they worship or anything like that. It came down to one major point. The Roman church said, we follow St. Peter. And the Irish church said, we follow St. John. And King Oswy said, well, John may have been Jesus' favorite, but he said to St. Peter, upon you I will build my church. So we're going to go this way. And that was it. Then the entire kingdom went Roman. Just little things like, it's just crazy how like little things like that, and that caused a huge shift in worship for thousands of people because he wanted to have dinner with his wife. little things, and there's so much of the culture that made such a big difference. One of my favorites, this is just an aside, one of my favorite things about learning all this stuff, like the Roman church, they're part of the Roman Empire. So they thought like the Romans thought. Again, the culture made this difference. In the Roman Empire, women were not highly regarded. Sometimes they were regarded as property. Not that great, sorry. But then the Roman church didn't have any women in leadership. The Irish church, women could be teachers, women could be professors, they could be doctors, they could be lawyers, they could be chieftains, they could even be king. So guess which church had no problem with women in ministry? They were women who led abbacy, and they were priestesses of their own. It's crazy. Even little things like when you hear the word monastery, I don't know if you think of this. When I hear the word monastery, I think of like a whole bunch of monks off in the desert doing their thing, like away from everybody. That's what happened in the Roman church. When I had to retrain how I thought, because I was reading about all these monasteries in Ireland, I'm like, this doesn't make any sense, and I had to research it. Monasteries in Ireland, dead center of the town. Because they didn't see themselves as apart from the community, they saw themselves as the community is with us. And so they would open their doors, and people would come in and eat with them, and they would worship together. It's just a different way of thinking. So where this evangelism thing got me thinking a lot about it. So the Roman culture, you've heard of the Roman Empire, they were awesome. They would come in, they would conquer you, and then they would ask you to conform to what they're doing. Conquer and conform. That was everything they did. They'd just ride into town, you're one of us now, and now that you're one of us, you're going to use our money, use our language, dress the way we dance the way we dance, worship our gods, whatever it would be, you have to be one of us. That is what we do. Does that sound like some churches sometimes? If you want to be a part of our church, that's great. You got to read the translation we read. You got to worship the way we worship. You've been baptized before. That's great, but your baptism doesn't count unless it's in our church. And then the other advantage of that is once you've conformed, you get sort of like a bonus. You get to be able to do other things. So like in the Roman culture, we're going to get to this with Pastor Mark in a few months, I guess, because it's in Acts like 16, Acts 22, where Paul is in trouble and he pulls out his Roman citizenship card. He is conformed. I'm a citizen. I now have extra benefits. I get a trial. You can't treat me like this. I'm a citizen. And so the church, again, what happens when you became a member? Well, then you could have communion. Then you could teach Sunday school, whatever it would be. Irish church was the opposite. See, where the Romans thought, you become one of us, then you get to experience worship with us. The Irish church was much, come experience worship with us, and through that you will find God. This whole idea of how they would do things. I mean, the Irish church is very different because when the first missionaries, whatever you want to call them, came in, they very much said, we're not going to overrun your culture. Who are you? We want to get to know you. And then they showed them Jesus through that. And there's this whole different thinking of how this goes through. The interesting part is, again, through a lot of the learning I've been trying to do, that's really a lot more what the Old Testament sounds like. It was this idea of we want people to come be a part of what we're doing, and you will find God. There are a lot of rules in the Old Testament that for celebrations and Passover, like we're talking about tonight, things like that, that include foreigners, visitors, servants. God very much thought about people who were outside and wanted them to be a part of what they were doing. But there was still that little bit of, well, but you got to take this extra step to be fully included. So if you want to be one of us, you still have to do the ritual, get the surgery, whatever it would be, and then you are now one of us, then you can be a part of something else that we're doing. And this mentality was a lot of what was going on in the church. It's interesting, when you look at some of the verses, I'm going to put this up. Galatians 3, we're no longer Jews or Greeks or slaves or free men or merely men or women. We are all the same. We're Christians, we're one in Christ Jesus. Colossians, in Christ there is not Greek or Jew, circumcision, uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, slave and free, but Christ is all and in all. Okay, these all sound beautiful. Did you notice the very first one in both of them? Greek or Jew. This idea of you're here, but we're here. They spent 1,500 years-ish thinking of everything as either clean or unclean. Pastor Mark talked about this Sunday. Remember about the story of Peter with the vision with the sheet coming down all the food? Because this is how people thought. They thought actions. This action is clean or this action is unclean. This food is clean, this food is unclean. This person is clean, this person is unclean. And this was always in the back of their heads as they're starting a church, as they're changing, even though Jesus said, like it says right there, Jesus is in all, he is all. Yeah, but some of us are clean and some of us aren't. And this is the mentality they were fighting with. So even with the Last Supper, it was part of the Passover celebration. And there was very much a part of this clean and unclean thinking. So everyone was invited to be a part of Passover, which is fantastic. And if you've never done a Passover or a Seder meal, do it. It's awesome. Because there's all sorts of these pieces that help you understand the story. Like you eat bitter herbs to remember the slavery. You drink, there's 4 different cups of wine about the cup of redemption and things of forgiveness. There's parts where you hear the story. There's parts where you pray. There's even a game for kids. There's all these little parts. And everyone is invited to do that except eating the lamb. Because that was set apart as something special only for those who were clean. So in the Passover story, if you've heard this story, but the Passover story, when there's the 10 plagues on Egypt, the 10th plague is the death of the firstborn, and the way that you told the angel of death that you belonged to God was you had to take a lamb, a clean lamb, a perfect lamb, exactly 1 year old, that had no spots, nothing wrong with it. You can't pick the one-eyed, three-legged lamb with a limp, okay? You got to have a right, good lamb. And when you did that, then you took the blood of the lamb when you sacrificed it, put it over your doorposts, and then the angel would pass over your house. Fantastic. Well, now when we celebrate this at Jesus' time, he would have to, you couldn't just use any lamb. You would go to the priest, and the priest would give you a lamb that was dedicated to God, that you would then go home and you would cook as part of the meal, and then only those who were clean were able to eat the lamb or eat that part of the meal. The rest, everything else, you're good. We want you to be involved. We want you to learn the story. We want you to see how God loves you. We want you to see how God saves people, but this is reserved for us until Jesus came along. Because when Jesus did the Last Supper, he added a part at the end. This is my body which is broken for you. This is my blood which is poured out for the sins, to cover the sins of many. So what he is doing is Jesus is replacing himself as that lamb. He is now the sacrifice for us. We get salvation not because of something that happened with a lamb 1,500 years before Jesus. Now what Jesus is saying is, I am choosing as the Son of God, who is holy and pure and wonderful and lived a sinless life. I'm going to sacrifice myself. I'm going to take on the sin of whoever asks and sacrifice myself so that we can be forgiven if we pray to him, so that we can then know him and we can have a relationship restored with God that we had before, and we can be who God made us to be. And interestingly enough, by doing that part of the meal, he is now replacing that part that was only for the chosen and saying, but now this sacrifice is available for everybody. Now we all get to take part in this. And even not just at the meal. We can do it any time. He said, do this as often as you meet. Because again, it's this idea of this celebration of the sacrifice of Christ, the celebration of the sacrifice so that sin is conquered is no longer just for the elite. It's now for everybody, which is fantastic. That sounds great. Do we still think that way, though? That's been the question that's been bothering me a lot. We may not see divisions of clean and unclean in the fact of like Jewish or Greek, but I bet if we ask, there's probably some ideas of what's a clean person and an unclean person when it comes to their soul, or what actions we think are clean or unclean, or even sometimes I don't think I'm clean. I think I'm a little unclean. It just happens. What does this mean, and how do we see this? Do we see it as God is inviting us and wants us to be a part of this, or do we see it as I feel separated from God because of this? How can we remember that this is now available for everyone? This is one of the things, honestly, this is one of the reasons I love the Methodist Church communion is open table. Everyone is welcome. We don't ask you to show your membership card. Anyone who wants to be a part of communion, you can, which is fantastic because I like this idea, this whole Irish thinking of the idea of how about we start inviting everyone to be a part of what we're doing. Invite everyone to come experience God with us And by experiencing God with us, they will find out who God is and how much he loves them. I mean, let's just be honest. Easter is 3 days away. There's a lot of people who have no intention of ever going to church 51 other weeks of the year, but they're looking for a church on Sunday. Are we willing to say, hey, why don't you come worship with us? I don't care what your past is. I don't care who you are or what you think or how you're different from us. That's not what this is about. We would like to invite you to worship with us. We want you to be a part of what we're doing. You know what? I'll even give up my pew on Sunday morning so you can sit where you want to. You know, are we willing to do what we can? Don't tell me that's not a big issue. I've been here. So are we willing to do whatever it is to make someone feel welcome? Because our goal is not to separate clean and unclean, but our goal instead is to invite everyone to be a part, because we recognize that as much as we like to say Christ loved us before we loved him, you know what? That also means Christ loved them before they loved him, or whoever they would be in your life. What if we were to invite people and ask them to be a part of this celebration with us on Sunday so that they could celebrate Christ's love and get to see it in action, and then be led to ask, how can I be a part of that? That's what I would hope for this Sunday. So here's what I'd like us to do. The choir is going to come up and sing in just a moment. As much as communion is open for everyone, in that section of 1 Corinthians, it very much says we need to prepare ourselves and be ready for communion. So I would love it if you would just take a moment, we would all take a moment, and just pray. God, do I see the sacrifice that you made as for me? Do I actually think about that? Do I realize that? Have I thought about it in a while? Am I thankful for that? When was the last time we thanked God for his sacrifice for us? But then also, God, who is going to be in my life in the next 3 days that I need to invite to come and be a part of this celebration with us? So feel free to take a moment with Jesus, choir, if you would.